Welcome Arnie Joahill, who's at the UEL Education Activist Network and led walkouts last year with his further education college.
The period between the 9th of November and the 10th of December was the largest and most militant student movement we've seen in the past few decades. If I just want to talk about what's happened in the past year, I mean, it's been amazing in scale. We've had revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia, mass uprisings in Syria, Yemen and Bahrain, to general strikes in Greece, and protests across Europe within the millions. We've also had occupations across the world. There are now 1,030 occupations across 98 different countries set up. Something that's really inspired me actually this year is 100,000 students in Chile who took to the streets and they occupied their Senate, led by young women. Not only that, but they put a blockade on their government, and now their government is in turmoil. And the same for Greece and Italy and Spain. Their governments are in turmoil right now. And what's been happening in the past few days and weeks in America, the occupations across Europe and across America in particularly, they're fighting against police brutality and rallying against the corporate greed that is so stifling in America. Now, for us as students, I think the most worrying thing is, and something that's really boring, is the educational white paper by Dave Willis. Never something been so dangerous and boring at the same time. The most important points of it is that I think there are three main points. There's firstly privatization. I mean, privatization of our universities. What they want to do is allow private companies to come in and buy departments off and sell our courses, our education back to us at the prices they want to set. They're not the best people to set our education. All they're concerned with is profit margins. We're concerned with our courses. For example, at London Met, 80% cuts at a university which has more black students in this university than all of the Russell Group's universities put together. That's how it's going to create a two-tier system where you have the universities at the top and universities at the bottom. And this is created by unproportional cuts. Now the second one is that was the first one, but yeah. Now I think for me this can have a real good effect now, because what it potentially can bring together is it can bring the students and workers together because of the same issues of what happened in last November at the student demos in November, when the students were smashing up Millbank and when they were occupying their universities and when they were walking down in Whitehall. Now this is what we can do. Now we've been here before. If you look at the CPE laws in France, in 2006 the French government wanted to introduce a new employment law where the employers could sack people after 2 years without any reason. And what happened there? The students, united with the workers, went onto the streets, and not only did they protest in Paris, they protested in their millions. They blocked the train lines, they disrupted the airports, and they put a blockade on France. And Chirac had to back down, and they didn't get through with that employment law. And this is what we have to do in Britain. Together we can Now, November the 9th and November the 30th, it's an important stepping stone for us. This is our attack. I mean, there's an attack on us. It's going to be huge. They're coming for the privatization of Britain. They want to privatize the whole country. They want to make living a premium. Now we are facing a massive attack where we have to fight for our services. And if we don't do this, we will win, Mark. We will win.
I'll be extremely brief. The focus of today is to try and get us, as we did last time really, just to stand back a little bit, to discuss the detail of the white paper, of course, and there are experts here who, unlike MPs, know what they're talking about on this issue. Jim's book in particular, I commend to you. I think it's an excellent summary, but there are a number of experts here who will take us through the detail of the implications of the white paper, and it's important that we do that. it's also important today that we stand back just to see where we're at and situate ourselves in relation to what the government's doing, but also what our response to what the government's doing right the way across the piece. The white paper itself and the legislation that will flow from it is obviously ineluctable. It's the inevitable consequences of what the government's analysis is. And I think in standing back and trying to look at this objectively, you need to try and put yourself in the place of the government ministers, if you like. So think of yourself as George Osborne. You're waking up this morning. You've been dreaming of your student days, how much you stuffed up your nose, and you're hoping that no one will publish that photograph of the woman you were with the SME practice. Anyway, but also you wake up and you think, fuck, it's 2011, I am really the Chancellor's Exchequer, and it is the worst recession since the 1930s. So what do you do? Literally, what do you do? What is this government doing? And you're in this situation where you do understand the reality of it. They're not stupid. They understand where we're at. And they know we're in an economic crisis not because of over-expenditure by the past New Labour government, because actually the levels of expenditure of the last New Labour government barely reached the levels of public expenditure of John Major or Margaret Thatcher. Look at some of the Treasury questions I put down in recent months. So you know actually that the deficit was caused, there is a structural deficit, it was caused because the last government, just as the previous Tory governments, cut taxation and allowed tax evasion and tax avoidance to take place. That's the structural deficit. So what do? You can't increase taxes as a Tory government. So what's the inevitable consequence? You've got to privatise and you've got to cut. And that's what they're doing. And we discussed this at the last network conference. Literally, it is the systematic dismantling of the welfare state. On top of that, cutting back on every level of expenditure of public services as you possibly can. And so inevitably, you've got to come round. You've got to move on to higher education, because that's the way you can cut some of the bulk out of education expenditure. And that's what's happening. And Osborne realises that the more you cut, actually the more you reduce aggregate demand, and the more you force yourself into a next double-dip recession. And that's where they're at. That's literally where they're at. So what does Osborne do? Well, he gets out of bed, he gets on his knees, and he prays. And he prays to the one deity that he has, which is the market. And he prays to the market. For God's sake, solve this through the market mechanism. Hence you accentuate the need to privatise, to throw everything into the market. And you realise that this is a European and a global recession, and you need a global level of intervention from government across the world to do that. But you also know that you can't make any European agreements, because if you do, you rip your own party apart, as we've seen last week with a whole group of Eurosceptics voting against their own government. So I think they've got themselves into a dilemma, and they know that. They know that. So what's the inevitable conclusion of that? Well, just they dig themselves in deeper, rely upon further privatisations and further cuts. That creates even deeper recession. And even the automatic, those of your economic students here, even the automatic stabilisers now are not working because you're cutting welfare benefits at the same time. And I think they know the hole they've got themselves into. And I also think they know the level of resistance. I think they know that. And that's why some of the most reactionary measures that we've ever seen are now being brought forward. It's happening every week. Alongside the cuts and privatisations, there's a new piece of legislation. Next week, they know they've cut housing so much. They know they have inherited a housing crisis from the last government, so they know that people are going to be desperate for a roof over their heads. And there'll be an increase in squatting. So what is happening next week? They're going to criminalise squatting. So you can get a year in prison, up to a year in prison, or a £5,000 fine, just for simply trying to find a roof over your heads. And it goes on. They know there's going to be the backlash from the trade unions is coming, so they now have a raft of new anti-trade union measures coming forward. They were looking in the legislation next week to criminalise occupations. They've pulled back from that for the time being because of what's happening in St Paul's. As simple as that. So as we go forward, and that's why this isn't a rant really, and my jokes aren't that funny really, but if we stand back objectively, we've got to realise just really what we're up against. A double-dip recession because of the inevitable consequences of this government's policies. In addition to that, the acknowledgement by this government that there is resistance now and it will build. and therefore the more repressive measures that they're bringing forward. Anti-trade union legislation to ban strikes in certain areas like emergency services, introduction of higher ballot ratios, so to authorise strikes you have to get higher turnouts, but in addition to that, in the next couple of weeks, two other consequences, the withdrawal of fertility times for trade unions, so you can't have the time to represent your members. Then in addition to that, if you do get sacked, you're charged for going to an employment tribunal just to prove you're innocent. That's the sort of range of measures this month. This is just this month that's happening. Why is that happening? Well, as I said, very briefly, they know the resistance is taking place. Objectively, if we stand back, and if we were mapping this out in terms of a campaign, there's a whole range of forms of resistance that takes place in terms of trying to change governments. One is through Parliament. Well, unfortunately, that route is almost debarred from us at the moment, because we have a coalition in government, but we also have a coalition in opposition. So, for example, New Labour next week has now said it will not be opposing the criminalisation of squatting. And now, issues like that means that the Labour Party itself becomes a terrain of struggle, because if they're not representing us, we have to take them on. Simple as that. The other area of resistance of the mechanism is the old-fashioned syndicalism, which is industrial action. Well, that's happening. We now have, on November the 30th, the largest form of industrial action that we've seen in a generation, and most probably beyond that. And it hasn't come about naively or spontaneously, it's been worked for. Groups of unions have come together in a trade union coordinating group within the TUC to see how they can coordinate their activity, their campaigning activity, their industrial activity. We've been wanting this for years, and now it's happened. So we'll have 3 million people out on strike on November the 30th, many of them striking for the first time ever, but also committed to continued activity if November the 30th doesn't work in the sense of changing government policy, which inevitably it won't. In addition to, so there's industrial action, but alongside industrial action, the other form of resistance that we've got, well, it's called insurrection, but we call it direct action now because we want to smooth it a bit down. Okay? Now, what the government can't cope with is that direct action is breaking out everywhere. Wherever you speak, there's forms of direct action that are hitting the government, and again, what we'll be seeing is repressive measures to bring forward that. So it's inevitable that they'll come for St Paul's. The City of London Corporation now looking for legal action to evict them. Well, I'm going to a meeting later on there, and we're looking at mechanisms for abolishing the City of London Corporation. And so, and what the government can't cope with is actions by UK Uncut, like the occupation of Fortnum and Masons, etc., where they're still prosecuting 30 demonstrators, has suddenly got popular support right the way across the country, even within circles that you would not expect to be supporting direct action. So they're faced with a lack of resistance in Parliament, but increasing pressure and struggle that's taking place even within the Labour Party now to force them into resistance. They're faced with industrial action, and they're also faced now with direct action and resistance. And our job now is to bring that all together, because our objective has got to be to bring this government down, to bring it down, for whatever mechanism we need to use. And the way we bring that all together is exercises like today. It's ideological. It's understanding the world we operate in, understanding the way these individual struggles are linked together, and understanding the common threat that we have. And I think it's working. I'll shut up at this. I think it's working. I think people now understand that it's not about spending too much on public services. It's not about us not being a wealthy country or anything like that. It is about the maldistribution of wealth, the lack of power, the lack of democracy in this country. So the demands now are about a fair taxation system. It is about tackling rich bastards like Martin Sorrell this week, who is proud of the £1 million he earns, plus all the bonuses and all the rest of it. It's about tackling the redistribution of wealth, but more importantly, it's about redistributing power as well. And that's what these demonstrations are important about, that we can control the streets, we can control our workplaces, and God help us, eventually we'll control the government. Solidarity.
Yeah, thank you, John. It's always a pleasure to listen to you. Our next speaker is Andrew McGettigan, who runs his own website, andrewmcgettigan.org. And if you haven't checked it out, it's definitely worth checking out about the financialization and privatization of our education. And so I would please give Andrew a very warm welcome.
Thanks very much for inviting me to this. I've had the I've had the misfortune this summer to have been engaged on a in-depth research program involving interviewing bankers, talking to the architects of the student loan scheme, and trying to get my handle on some of the detail behind the white paper. I'm not going to force that upon you now because it's very complicated and I've written about it extensively elsewhere. But I just want to emphasise that the white paper is a sort of summary, but often the most important things are vague and not properly explained. It is an extended plan, but it's botched in detail. And this is an important thing, I think, to think about the coming together and organisers, to focus on how this botched detail gives an extra point of leverage in the campaign. But on the other hand, because it's so extended and it's dispersed and it's being run through various channels, through consultations, through budget cuts, through bits of secondary legislation, and maybe eventually next year there'll be some primary legislation, it presents a challenge to organising because it's designed to disperse opposition, to make it hard for people to understand what's going on and what they want to do about it. There's an enormous problem of demographic deficit in the way in which the coalition is pursuing this policy. But I just want to emphasise that at the same time, because it's dispersed in this way, there's an awful lot of opposition. So, for example, if you read the personal finance section of the Daily Mail, they're absolutely opposed to this assault on middle-class finances and future middle class. It's not progressive in the classical sense of a taxation, insofar as a lot of the burden will fall most heavily on people earning over 40,000, but not people earning over 60,000. So there's opposition there. If you read the responses from Oxford and Cambridge to the white paper, they're opposed to it because it challenges their institutional autonomy about how they recruit their students. If you read the university lobby groups, they're opposed to it because it puts a squeeze on them and forces many of them to become cheap degree shops and ruins the kind of provision they offer at the moment to the public at large. If you look at some VCs, they're waiting for backing from the public and from their own academics to break away from Universities UK, the lobby group for university vice-chancellors. And if you want to know who they are, have a look at the ones who are offering bursaries to their students, which will benefit students while they're studying, as opposed to fee waivers, which only benefit the Treasury. People like Patrick McGee at the University of East London, people like Martin Hall at Salford, those are VCs who are opposed to the white paper. Those are people you need to bring on board and help them to do what they can do at their level. Similarly, the campaign for public university, of which I'm happy to be a part, we're opposed to this idea that higher education is only about training for employability. That what you do when you go to university is you make a human capital investment, and the return on that investment is future higher earnings. That's what private training providers do. It shouldn't be what public higher education is about. Now, even the architects of the loan schemes, the guys who've theorised it, are in despair at the government's loan scheme. It's so badly designed now that by the time it reaches operational maturity in 2046, it actually takes 30 years to get up and running properly. The outstanding student loan debt will be 191 billion. That's effectively an additional quarter onto public net debt. So although removing grants and replacing it with loans to pay tuition fees reduces the deficit, loans don't count against the deficit, but they do count because borrowing required to finance them is enormous. And because of the badly designed repayment plan, it's not until 30 years down the line that the money they're getting back in graduate repayments actually matches each new loans out year. So it's only in 2042, 2043 that the government's own figures suggest the scheme will begin to break even. And by that point, there's an extra 190 billion of debt. So you've got all these people opposing it from all these various interests. The challenge for organising then is, are you, the education activists, are we one more point of opposition in this dispersed field of opposition, or can we bring that together and focus? And I suggest that's one of the things to concentrate on today is, where is the focus? How do you bring together all of this various opposition so it's not just dispersed into opinion and despair and a bleak view, which is what I'm often accused of presenting at these events, is the bleakest speaker on the table. The plan's extended, but it can be stopped. But what I suggest is that, while I would entirely back what John said about the need to bring down the government, there's absolutely one thing we must win, and that's preventing for-profit companies getting access to the loan scheme. The loan scheme is publicly backed. If you give for-profit companies access to that loan scheme, you've changed the system in an entirely new way. Management consultants are describing the UK as Treasure Island for American-based multinationals precisely because of this proposed access to the loans book. They won't be able to do it unless the primary legislation they need next year goes through the Houses of Parliament. But just to explain what that means, because of the mechanics of the way the loan book works, universities will get the fees up front for each student they recruit. But the debt is a relationship then between the graduate and the government, the student loans company. The university's got the money. It doesn't have to worry about who repays it. The student loans company will act as the collector for the private company's debts that they've incurred in that system. It's basically the factor working on behalf of for-profit companies to get the debt back in. And the institution's only concern then is recruitment. The more it recruits, the more money it gets. It doesn't have to worry about completion rates. In the States, we see the for-profit companies' completion rates are atrocious. Something like the University of Phoenix, at the end of 6 years after starting, only 11% of students have graduated. But these are precisely the people who Willits has been talking to and preparing for the white paper. Why are we setting up a system which looks less regulated than British football? Why do we not have something like a fit and proper owner test for universities? Why are we contemplating people who are under investigation in the United States for running recruitment boiler rooms? We have the scripts, it's all on the record, the cases are ongoing. Why are these companies like Education Management Corporation, Laureate, Kaplan, Polo, who run the University of Phoenix and also run BPP over here, why are these the people that Willits has been talking to prior to the white paper? You see, because at the end of the day, because of the way the loan scheme works, it's the taxpayer who will pick up that loss. It's the taxpayer who will have to pick up that 191 billion debt if the government's projections about the graduate premium wage increases in the next 30 years don't match their model. At that point, when the estimates and the actuals don't come together, the additional debt that's put onto the public may be huge. And in that sense, I think one thing just to emphasise is that it's this difference between charities and for-profits. Higher education is a charitable endeavour as opposed to a for-profit endeavour, which is more important to stress than privatisation. One of the difficulties with privatisation in this context is that most universities are already private institutions. King's College is a corporation with a royal charter. LSE over the road is a company limited by guarantee. So is London Metropolitan. The University of Westminster is a company limited by guarantee. These are already private in terms of their legal form, but they've been in receipt of state funding because there's a sense there's a public good and there's a historical compromise around this. To focus on privatisation may be to miss the bigger point, which is for-profit and charities. And just to sort of finish off on this point, it's important to understand that even when then you focus on the for-profits, something like Grayling's New College of the Humanities, which features in the publicity for the event, is not at all to do with the white paper. The government would rather that had never happened. The only things on record from the government about the New College of the Humanities was a statement from the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills which said, New College of the Humanities is not a university, it cannot be under the current terms, it has not applied for that status. Now, the New College of the Humanities is spectacularly off message because the point about for-profits isn't that they're going to be incredibly expensive. In fact, they're going to be incredibly cheap. The reason why the for-profits are being allowed into the sector is to undercut established universities, is to run cheap, mass-produced, commodified education which will be offered to the public in opposition to what looks like the high fees of established universities who will be charging £7,000, £8,000. The for-profits can come in and roll out mass education for £4,000. But it's a very different concept of education, and much closer to this one we've already mentioned of training for employability. 2-year degrees, gym membership model schemes, all of this kind of low-end education. And it's that which I think is the biggest threat to education today. And this I'm going to read out just what the University of Cambridge said about this danger in its official response to the white paper. And this is not from the campaign groups at Cambridge, this is from the Cambridge Council. They said, there is a serious long-term risk that new providers will be prepared to operate initially at a loss to take market share from some universities that will then become unviable. In many cases, this would be to the detriment of local and regional communities who would then lose the wider benefits that a local university with its diverse range of activities can provide, and which new operators without the same roots in local communities are unlikely or unwilling to provide and are not required to provide under legislation. This effect would be gravely exacerbated if the new operators were to close because they had misjudged their financial models or withdrew their services locally as market conditions changed or their attention was drawn elsewhere. We could then be left with a depleted university sector and damaged communities. So I'll just conclude by saying I think this is the one thing that must be won. Or everything else is, any other small victories will be small scale if this one isn't achieved. And so that's my kind of question for today, is how do we motivate this disparate opposition to say we shouldn't sacrifice our higher education system, which is based upon the notion of charity, public benefit, broader public good, for training providers who can come in at cost-cutting levels and effectively wipe out the competition. It's an incredibly reckless gamble. The kind of competition we won't have seen before between the educational charities and enormous for-profit companies. The market capitalisation of Pearson is something like $10 billion. The entire English higher education sector has an annual turnover of about £20 million. So you can see that Pearson alone is, it's not like-for-like turnover and market capitalisation, but the scale of these companies, when you add them together, 4 or 5 big US-based multinationals will be bigger than the current education sector in England. If we let them in, we're not going to be able to take them out again. This is irreversible, and this is why when the mainstream political parties are debating whether they'll put the fees at this level or they'll put the fees at this level, it doesn't really matter. If they let the for-profits in, we know from the previous experience of privatisation it's very hard to get them out again. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I think everybody's main enemy these days is Universities Minister David Willits. I just recall an incident when he came to speak at SOAS, and several students were chasing him down the corridor in October, and that repeated over the course of the year. When he came back in third term, he was being chased off campus, and hundreds of police were having to secure the building. But there's also a different campaign happening, the No Confidence campaign in David Willits. And Kate Tunstall from the Oxford campaign is going to give us a short speech of what they have done at Oxford.
Hi, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. So I've been asked to say something about the No Confidence campaign, which is noconfidence.org.uk. It started on the 7th of June this year when the University of Oxford shook off its fuddy-duddy reputation. The Oxford University Campaign for Higher Education, also known as OUCH because cuts hurt, called a meeting of the university's sovereign body, which is called Congregation, the same body that in 1985 succeeded in voting against Margaret Thatcher getting an honorary degree. So we called that body together and we debated the following motion. Congregation instructs Council, that's to say the Vice-Chancellor, to communicate to this government that the University of Oxford has no confidence in the policies of the Minister for Higher Education. It took us ages to get that wording right. It was like academics, doing commas and peer review and all the rest of it. But the students told us to go, as the nurses had done, for a simple motion of no confidence, and they were right. It was a hugely consensus-building proposition. On the day, it was carried by a landslide. And the wording also meant that we hadn't just voted no confidence, we told our Vice-Chancellor that he had to write to David Willits personally to tell him that that's what we thought. I still find myself walking to work sometimes chanting, David Willits makes no sense, Oxford votes no confidence, which is what the students were chanting outside. We had got our voice back. We'd spoken without reference to RAEs or REFs or assessment exercises or excellence frameworks or outputs. We were young and old, junior and emeritus, student, librarian, faculty from the arts and the sciences. there was a beautiful moment when one speaker invited the audience to look up. And when we all looked up, what we saw is this painting on the ceiling, which has the arts and the sciences united in the fight against ignorance. Of course, it was just a little vote in a university town, but it was also a spark. The philosophy department at KCL voted no confidence, followed by classics, French, history, film studies, European studies, religious studies, and Hellenic studies. Bath voted at its academic assembly, Leeds at its university senate, the Feminist and Women's Studies Association voted at its AGM. There were petitions buzzing around the internet launched from Warwick and Goldsmiths and UCU. And it could ignite again. UCU has a petition with 17,000 signatures on it. We need to think about what we can do with it. We need to work locally, I think, and get motions of no confidence put and passed at each university and college and student union and professional association at whatever is its most democratic body. The no confidence may have no in its title, but it is entirely positive. It allows, I think, all the constituencies of each educational institution to unite around a single inspiring idea. We can come together to fight for the intrinsic values of our collectively owned life, and that with careful planning and painstaking cooperation, we can succeed.
I think Andrew and Kate have explained really well some of the implications of the white paper and indicated some of the possible channels that we can take our opposition down. I'd advise everybody to read the white paper. You can get it online, and in many ways it's like watching a bad episode of The Apprentice or The Dragon's Den or one of these programs where every other word is about the forces of competition, about choice, about value for money, but it actually sets up mechanisms that are incredibly destructive to our universities. And what it's attempting to do is remove state funding as far as possible from university teaching, but make students pay for it in the form of loans which they will get from the government, while at the same time creating an artificial market, a state-created market for places at university, putting pressure on universities to compete with each other and shift the focus of what they do from teaching and research to marketing and branding, and then at the same time allowing, as Andrew has said, for-profit providers to come in and compete with universities, get a foothold in the sector, and take students out of public universities into the private sector. And it's explicit in the white paper at the outset. They announce that universities are not part of the public sector and their staff are not public sector employees, and then they indicate what link they have to the public sector, which is state funding and the government control of admissions places. They allocate the number of places that universities will be able to take, and also regulation that the government is responsible for. And these are the things that they want to get rid of. They want to reduce the amount of regulation, reduce the amount of direct state funding, because what it's about is part of a generalised attack on the public sector. And this isn't just rhetoric. This is what's happening in the NHS, where there'll be no limit on the number of private beds that can be taken up in hospitals, where private providers are being invited to come in and cherry-pick services. It's the same thing that's happening with free schools. It's the same thing that's happening with the outsourcing of local government services. It's the implementation across Britain of Thatcher's notion that there is no such thing as society. And what they are attempting to do with this white paper is destroy the notion of a public university. And there are very specific mechanisms that they've set up in order to do that. And so one of the things that they want to do is turn students from active participants in their education into the passive recipients of a service, turn them into customers by giving them these loans, which they say is putting financial power in the hands of students. That makes student choice meaningful. This means students are going to graduate with double the level of debt that they have now. It's estimated students will graduate with about £50,000 worth of debt, and it's estimated that about a quarter of this will be in the form of commercial loans at high rates of interest. Then what they want to do is mess around with the admission system in universities. So at the moment, each university is allocated a number of student places, and generally this means universities can plan their teaching, their staffing provision and so on year on year. What they're going to do is take out all the students who achieve AAB grades or above, that's 65,000 students, and reduce the quota across the board proportionately, while taking another 20,000 places out of students who don't get AAB, that universities charging 7,500 or less will be able to compete for. So if we take the AAB students, the 65,000 students that will be taken out, and universities will be told it's a free-for-all, you all compete for these places. Now, 29% of AAB students go to private schools. Private schools represent 6% of the population. A further 10% of AAB students go to grammar schools. They represent a tiny proportion of schools. 10 universities recruit 40% of AAB students. Research has shown that BBB students from state schools, once they get to university, do as well as the private school students who've got ABB or AAB. So what this measure is doing is, it's not, as they say, promoting academic ability and encouraging excellent teaching and choice and so on. It's privileging the privilege at entry, at the entry point. So it's so-called elite institutions that will compete for these places. Those that lose out will have to cut fees in order to get the number of students they need. They'll have to cut fees and compete for the 20,000 students who don't get AAB, or they'll have to cut costs, they'll have to cut their staffing levels. So the idea of student choice is completely fake. What the government is doing is creating a really grotesque game show, like a kind of game of musical chairs, where every year they're taking students out of the quota and they're throwing them onto the supposed open market, but a completely artificially created open market. And it will mean that the pressure on universities is to always cut costs, while at the same time telling students that the quality of education they're getting is better and better all the time, even as it declines. So the 20,000 places that they're taking out for students who don't get AAB will be open to competition, not just between universities, but further education colleges and the for-profit sector. So they're going to ease regulation in order to allow for-profit providers to get degree awarding powers, to get the status of a university, and they will also, as Andrew's explained, have access to public money. So they will be able to take the student loans and turn that public money into private profit. And the number of students that they're able to compete for will increase year on year. That's the plan in the white paper. So the for-profit providers, what they're interested in, as the name implies, is profit. So they will attempt to drive costs down all the time. People may have seen articles this week about private providers who don't recognise trade unions and the studies that have been done in the States that show that their loyalty is to their shareholders and to the bottom line, to returning a profit. A huge amount of their expenditure goes on marketing, a huge proportion. Some for-profit providers spend more on marketing in the States than they do on teaching. So for all the white paper says about our aim is to bring back excellent teaching, there is nothing in the white paper about how excellent teaching will be provided. Instead, there are a whole lot of demands on universities to produce endless data about their individual courses, what students end up going on, what jobs they end up doing after having studied a particular course. The student surveys that lecturers hand out at the end of a course will be put online to encourage, as they put it, competition between the best academics. So there will be just a proliferation of the kind of guff that we see already. If you take this institution, there's an awful lot that could be said that's very positive about King's, about the tradition of teaching and research at the institution, about the innovations and the discoveries that have been made here, including the research on DNA and so on. What you get if you go on the website now is a page that says the most central university in London. They might as well just say it's near the shops. If you go outside, there's a thing that says World Questions, King's Answers. So you can send in your question, where's Gaddafi? What would Jesus do? Is David Willett's second brain visible through thermal imaging? And you don't get a response. What you get is an invitation to donate to the refurbishment of Somerset House. So this is going to be the process that resource is diverted increasingly in towards this kind of parody of what a university is, while at the same time they're saying 95% of students will be better off because you don't pay back your loan, even though it will cripple you with debt for the rest of your life. You don't pay it back until you start earning £21,000. What they're saying about helping poorer students, the system that they're setting up will work completely against that, because the universities that generally provide for the poorer students will have their resources cut because their fees will be lower, they won't get as much direct state funding. And so Martin Hall, that Andrew mentioned, the Vice-Chancellor at Salford, says the only way that you can compete charging fees at that level is to dramatically reduce staffing. So what the white paper is going to do is intensify everything that is wrong with universities at the moment, intensify processes of privatisation, marketisation, cost-cutting, a tax on jobs, a tax on pensions, a tax on pay, a tax on course provision, and they will attempt to pit students against staff. But what the white paper also does, I think, and this comes back to something that Andrew and Kate have mentioned, is it creates the potential for an incredibly broad alliance of people who simply believe in the public universities, simply come into universities, whether as students or staff, because they want to learn, because they want to engage critically and understand the world better. This white paper will destroy that ethos, will destroy not just the abstract sense of the public sector, but destroy the notion of, or the meaning of what it is to teach and research, to study at a university. So it's really not just an abstract slogan to say this is about the 1% benefiting at the expense of the 99%. The majority of us have an interest in opposing this white paper. It will destroy our university system. And I think if we want an example of the kind of campaign that can be built, I was in France in 2005 when they opposed the neoliberal revision to the EU constitution. Both the main parties supported the constitution, and a campaign was built through people like us, really, people who worked in universities, people who were part of think tanks or grassroots organisations or trade unions, they built a campaign that won a majority of the population to oppose that neoliberal constitution. And I think that's the kind of thing that has happened at universities over the last couple of years. When we faced attacks on our jobs, at King's, we united people who were union members with people who simply thought it was a good idea that people could study paleography. And we won them to the idea that in order to defend that, you had to take resolute action. And that can be in the form of petitions, it can be in the form of demonstrations and protests, and it also needs to involve strike action. And I think that's the kind of campaign that we need to build. We need to build, meticulously explaining what's in the white paper, developing sophisticated analyses of the white paper, and then popularising those arguments so that people understand the threat they face, and then joining with the rest of the population that wants to oppose what's happening to hospitals, to schools, to pensions across the public sector, and going from November the 30th to building a movement. In France, they had a referendum, they had one vote. We'll have to apply all the pressure points on the government and on MPs and build a huge campaign so that when the white paper goes before Parliament, we're in a position to defeat it. And that may mean shutting down our entire university system if we have to do that.